This story is about family betrayal, favoritism, and the moment a daughter realizes that silence has cost her more than speaking ever could. And my name is Rachel Morgan, and it began on Thanksgiving evening when my sister set down her wine glass, smiled sweetly across the table and announced, "Mom and Dad are signing the house to me. You get nothing." And the room went quiet except for the soft clink of silverware, while my mother avoided my eyes and my father cleared his throat like this was old news I should have already accepted. For a second I honestly thought it was a joke, the kind of awkward humor my sister liked to use to feel superior, but then she laughed lightly and added, "I mean, it makes sense. You're doing fine on your own." And that was when the humiliation hit, sharp and unmistakable, because no one corrected her, no one defended me, and no one even looked surprised. I felt every eye at the table flick toward me and then away, as if my reaction was something uncomfortable they didn't want to witness, and I forced a small smile, the one I'd perfected over years of swallowing disappointment, and said nothing, because reacting would have only confirmed what they'd always believed about me, that I was emotional, dramatic, difficult. The smell of turkey and cinnamon suddenly made me nauseous, and as my sister continued talking about renovations and future plans for her house, the house we'd both grown up in, memories began stacking in my mind faster than I could stop them, each one reminding me that this moment wasn't sudden or shocking at all, just brutally honest. That house had been my refuge during college breaks, the place I returned to when my first apartment fell through, the address I still used on official documents because it had always felt like the one constant in my life, and now it was being casually handed to my sister like a reward she'd always been promised. My father finally spoke, his voice low and measured, saying, "Rachel, this isn't personal. Your sister just needs more stability." And I remember thinking how strange it was that my years of independence had somehow become evidence that I deserved less, not more. I wanted to ask when stability became something you earned by needing it loudly, by demanding it, by taking up space, but instead I folded my napkin carefully, placed it beside my plate, and listened as my sister leaned back in her chair and said, "Don't worry, you can always visit." The way someone speaks about a vacation home, not a place filled with childhood memories. The rest of dinner passed in a blur of forced laughter and shallow conversation, my mother refilling glasses and changing subjects whenever the tension threatened to surface, and I noticed how easily they all moved on, as if this announcement hadn't just rewritten my place in the family. When dessert was served, my aunt commented on how close sisters should be, and my sister reached over and squeezed my hand theatrically, whispering, "You're okay, right?" And I nodded because saying no had never changed anything before. Inside, though, something cracked open, not loudly, but in a way that felt final, like a truth I could no longer pretend not to see. And as I drove home later that night, the windshield wipers moving steadily against the dark, I replayed every word, every look, every silence, and realized that the real betrayal wasn't the house itself, but how openly disposable I'd been made to feel. That Thanksgiving wasn't just a family gathering, it was a declaration, delivered without apology, that my role was to accept whatever was left over, to be grateful for scraps of inclusion, while my sister was handed guarantees. Sitting alone in my car outside my apartment, keys still in the ignition, I felt the weight of years press down on me, years of being the reasonable daughter, the adaptable one, the one who didn't ask for much, and I understood, finally, that my quiet endurance hadn't protected me at all. It had only taught them that they could take everything without consequence, and as painful as that realization was, it marked the beginning of something I hadn't felt before, clarity. Growing up, the imbalance between my sister and me was never announced outright, but it was reinforced so consistently that it became the unspoken rule of our family, shaping every interaction long before that Thanksgiving confession ever reached the table. My sister Laura was always described as sensitive and special, words my parents used like protective shields whenever she failed, struggled, or demanded more, while I was labeled strong, independent, and low maintenance. Compliments that sounded positive on the surface but carried an expectation that I would never need as much care, time, or understanding. When we were children, if Laura forgot her homework or skipped chores, my mother would rush in to smooth things over, telling her not to be too hard on herself, while my mistakes were treated as lessons I needed to learn on my own, my father saying things like, "You're smarter than this, Rachel," as if disappointment were a tool meant to sharpen me. Holidays followed the same pattern, Laura's wishes dominating gift lists and travel plans, while my preferences were treated as flexible, optional, something to be adjusted if it made things easier for everyone else. I learned early that praise was rare for me, but expectation was constant, And so I adapted, becoming the daughter who didn't complain, who excelled quietly, who moved out early and built a life without asking for much, because needing less felt like the only way to belong. In high school, when Laura decided she hated her extracurriculars and wanted to quit halfway through the year, my parents rearranged schedules and finances to support her new interests. But when I asked for help attending a summer program that would boost my college applications, I was told it was a good opportunity to learn responsibility and find my own funding. At the time, I convinced myself this was fair, even healthy, because that was easier than acknowledging how unequal it felt, and over time that denial hardened into habit. The favoritism grew subtler as we became adults, disguised as practicality and logic rather than emotion, my parents insisting they weren't choosing Laura over me, just responding to who needed them more, never questioning why she always seemed to need them more or why I had learned to survive without that safety net. When Laura moved back home after college, unsure of her next step, my parents welcomed her without hesitation, covering expenses and reassuring her that she had time to figure things out. But when I faced my own uncertainty years later after a job transition, my father suggested it might be a good opportunity for me to test my resilience, as if comfort were something I'd outgrown. Family gatherings reinforced the hierarchy quietly but relentlessly, conversations orbiting around Laura's feelings, her relationships, her plans, while my updates were acknowledged politely before attention drifted back to her, and each time, I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need to be the center to feel secure. The truth was, I had learned to equate love with usefulness and acceptance with silence, believing that as long as I didn't rock the boat, there would always be a place for me, even if it was smaller, even if it was conditional. Looking back, the warning signs were everywhere, from the way my parents spoke about the house as Laura's future long before any paperwork existed, to the casual jokes about how I was the responsible one, who didn't need a safety net. And I ignored them because acknowledging them would have forced me to confront the possibility that my role wasn't temporary or accidental, but permanent. By the time that Thanksgiving announcement was made, the groundwork had already been laid over decades, each small act of favoritism reinforcing the belief that Laura's comfort outweighed my fairness, and that my emotional endurance was something to be relied upon rather than respected. And as painful as it was to see it so clearly now, that clarity was impossible to unlearn, because it revealed that the betrayal at the table wasn't a sudden choice, but the inevitable outcome of a family dynamic that had been quietly training me to accept less my entire life. The real escalation came not in private conversations or subtle slights, but in moments where the imbalance was displayed openly, turning what I had always endured quietly into something impossible to ignore or excuse. After that Thanksgiving announcement, my sister didn't retreat into guilt or embarrassment the way I once hoped she might. Instead, she leaned into her new position with a confidence that bordered on cruelty, as if the declaration had given her permission to finally say out loud what she had always believed. In the weeks that followed, she brought up the house casually in conversations with extended family, laughing about renovation plans and referring to it as my place while I sat nearby, expected to smile along as if it were a harmless joke rather than a reminder of what had been taken from me without discussion. My parents reinforced this dynamic by correcting anyone who seemed confused, explaining that Laura needed stability, and that I was doing fine on my own, statements delivered with a calm certainty that made questioning them feel like an overreaction. One afternoon during a family brunch meant to celebrate my cousin's promotion, Laura raised her glass and made a mock toast, thanking Mom and Dad for believing in her future, then added with a smirk that at least one of their daughters would never have to worry about housing costs again, her eyes flicking toward me just long enough for the message to land. Laughter followed, not loud or malicious but polite and uncomfortable, and no one challenged her. Not even when my father chuckled and said something about how family resources had to be allocated wisely, reducing my sense of loss to a budget decision rather than a betrayal. I felt cornered in those moments, trapped between the urge to defend myself and the fear that speaking up would only confirm the narrative that I was difficult, ungrateful, or dramatic, and so I stayed quiet, my silence misinterpreted as agreement rather than restraint. The manipulation became more deliberate when Laura began asking me for favors related to the house she was set to inherit, sending me listings for furniture she wanted my opinion on, casually suggesting I help her research contractors, and acting offended when I declined, accusing me of being unsupportive and bitter. When I finally told her that watching her plan a future built on something I was excluded from was painful, She rolled her eyes and said I was choosing to feel hurt, reminding me that Mom and Dad were free to do whatever they wanted with their property, and that I should be happy for her instead of keeping score. My parents echoed this sentiment during a tense phone call, telling me they were disappointed that I couldn't be more mature about the situation, framing my discomfort as selfishness and Laura's entitlement as practicality, and that reversal left me emotionally stranded, doubting my own reactions even as the evidence mounted. The humiliation reached its peak at a neighborhood gathering hosted by my parents, where Laura announced in front of friends and neighbors that she would soon be taking over the house, thanking them for raising her right and joking that it was good they had a backup daughter who didn't need much anyway. A line that earned a few uneasy laughs and a quick change of subject. Standing there, surrounded by people who had watched us grow up, I felt stripped of dignity, reduced to a supporting character in my own family's story. And still I said nothing because confrontation in that moment would have made me look reactive rather than wronged. Inside, though, something shifted, not into anger or vengeance yet, but into a sharp awareness that my silence was no longer protecting me. It was protecting them, allowing the narrative to continue unchallenged while I absorbed the consequences. That realization didn't bring immediate action, but it did bring clarity, and as I left that gathering early, listening to Laura laugh behind me as if she had won something she had never questioned deserving, I understood that staying quiet was no longer neutral. It was a choice, and if I didn't change it soon, I would spend the rest of my life watching my own exclusion be rewritten as fairness in front of an audience that had never heard my side. What changed after that wasn't my outward behavior, because to anyone watching, I was still the same quiet, accommodating daughter who didn't make scenes or issue ultimatums, but internally I stopped trying to convince myself that endurance alone would eventually earn fairness. Instead of arguing or pleading, I began paying attention, replaying conversations in my mind and noticing details I had once dismissed, like how my parents spoke about the house in vague terms whenever paperwork was mentioned, or how Laura avoided specifics when she bragged about what she would do once it was officially hers. I realized that for years, I had accepted explanations without ever seeing proof, trusting that family decisions were handled honestly simply because they were framed as loving and reasonable, and that trust had allowed everyone else to move forward without accountability. Quietly, I started asking neutral questions, not accusatory ones, just enough to gather information, like whether the will had been updated recently, or if there were any legal steps already completed, and the hesitation in my parents' responses told me more than their words did. At the same time, I reached out to a family friend who worked in real estate law under the pretense of general curiosity, learning how property transfers actually worked, what signatures were required, and how verbal promises held no legal weight, and each detail added another layer to my understanding of how precarious my parents' plan really was. I didn't tell Laura any of this, letting her continue to believe that her future was settled and unquestionable, because I knew that if she sensed resistance, she would rush to secure her advantage, and I needed time to see the full picture before making any move. I also began revisiting old documents I had stored away years earlier, things I hadn't thought about in a long time, including emails and letters related to a loan I had quietly helped my parents with during a difficult financial period, money I had transferred without ceremony because I believed helping family didn't require conditions. Those records showed dates, amounts, and promises made casually but clearly, references to repayment or future consideration that had never been fulfilled, and as I read through them, I realized that my contributions hadn't just been emotional or practical, they had been tangible and traceable. Instead of feeling anger, I felt a strange calm settle in, because facts, unlike feelings, didn't depend on anyone's approval to exist. I scheduled a consultation with a lawyer not to threaten or confront but to understand my standing, and when she explained that my financial involvement gave me certain rights I had never asserted, I felt something close to relief, not because I wanted to take anything away, but because I finally saw that the story I had been told, that I was simply less entitled, less deserving, wasn't supported by reality. Throughout this period, I maintained the same surface-level politeness with my family, attending gatherings, responding to messages, even listening as Laura continued to talk about the house as if it were already hers, and that contrast between what they believed and what I now knew gave me a quiet sense of control. I wasn't plotting revenge in dramatic gestures or rehearsed speeches. I was preparing for clarity, for the moment when truth would replace assumptions and power would shift not through shouting, but through documentation and law. By the time I felt ready to move forward, my goal wasn't to embarrass anyone or reclaim attention. It was to stop the rewriting of my life as a footnote, to ensure that whatever happened next would be based on facts rather than favoritism, and that decision, made silently and deliberately, marked the first time I chose myself without asking for permission. The confrontation didn't happen in a dramatic family meeting or a heated argument, but in a setting chosen deliberately so that emotion couldn't overpower truth. Because by then I understood that feelings were where I always lost and facts were where I could finally stand on equal ground. I asked my parents to meet me at a local attorney's office under the guise of discussing estate planning questions, framing it as something responsible rather than confrontational, and they agreed without suspicion, even inviting Laura along because, as my mother put it, she should be involved since it will all be hers anyway. Sitting across from the attorney, a calm woman with a precise voice and an impressive stack of files, I listened as my parents confidently repeated the story they had been telling everyone else, explaining that they intended to sign the house over to Laura because she needed stability, while I was financially independent and would understand. The attorney nodded politely, then turned to me and asked if I wanted to add anything before they proceeded. And for the first time in years, I didn't soften my words or minimize my position, simply stating that before any transfer occurred, I wanted the full financial history related to the property addressed. The room shifted immediately, Laura's smile tightening as my father asked what I meant, and I calmly slid copies of bank transfers, emails, and loan agreements across the table, documentation showing how I had contributed a significant portion of the down payment years earlier when my parents were close to losing the house, money given with the explicit understanding that it wasn't a gift, but an investment meant to be repaid or recognized. The attorney reviewed the papers carefully, then explained in clear, unemotional terms that my financial contribution gave me a legal interest in the property, one that could not be ignored or transferred away without my consent, and that any attempt to do so could expose my parents to serious legal consequences. Laura's confidence cracked instantly, her voice rising as she insisted this was unfair, that she had planned her life around the house, that I was trying to sabotage her future. But the attorney cut through the noise by reminding her that intentions and promises didn't override documented facts. My mother looked stunned, as if she were seeing the situation for the first time rather than the version she had constructed in her head, while my father stared at the table, silent, his earlier certainty replaced by something close to fear. When the attorney added that my contributions, combined with the lack of repayment, could entitle me not only to a share of the property but also to compensation if matters escalated, the power dynamic flipped completely, the narrative of me as the low-maintenance daughter dissolving under the weight of evidence. Laura tried one last tactic, turning to my parents and accusing me of betraying the family, but for once the room didn't echo her outrage, because betrayal loses its impact when it's exposed as deflection. I didn't raise my voice or issue threats. I simply stated that I wasn't there to punish anyone, but I would no longer allow my silence to be used against me, and that any future decisions would need to acknowledge reality rather than convenience. The authority in the room wasn't emotional or parental anymore, it was legal and impartial, and as the meeting ended with the attorney outlining next steps that required my involvement and consent, I watched my family process a truth they could no longer dismiss, realizing that the quiet daughter they had underestimated had finally stepped into a position where she couldn't be talked over, laughed at, or erased. By the time everything settled, there was no explosive fallout, no dramatic shouting match, just a quiet rearranging of reality that felt far more powerful than any argument ever could. The legal process moved forward steadily, and while my parents didn't suddenly transform into fair or self-aware people, they were forced to operate within boundaries they could no longer bend, resulting in a revised agreement that formally recognized my financial stake in the house and protected it from being quietly signed away. Laura stopped calling me altogether after that meeting, not because she had suddenly understood my pain, but because her usual weapons, guilt, comparison, and emotional pressure, no longer worked when there was nothing left to manipulate. My parents tried, in their own restrained way, to frame the outcome as a misunderstanding rather than a deliberate pattern, but I no longer needed them to admit fault to feel whole, because justice doesn't require apology when it provides closure. What surprised me most was the sense of calm that followed. Not triumph or revenge, but relief, the kind that comes when you finally stop carrying a weight you were never meant to hold alone. I moved forward with a clearer sense of self, no longer defining my worth by how much space my family allowed me to take up, but by the boundaries I was now capable of enforcing without guilt. Thanksgiving came again the following year, quieter and more restrained, And while the dynamic was forever altered, it was also honest for the first time, stripped of illusions that had once kept me silent. I didn't need their approval anymore, because I had proven, to them and to myself, that endurance paired with clarity can outlast favoritism and rewrite outcomes that once felt inevitable. This story was never really about a house or inheritance, but about a daughter who learned that being overlooked doesn't make you powerless. It simply means your strength is being underestimated. And sometimes the most satisfying justice isn't watching others fall, but standing firmly in a life where they no longer control the narrative. If you enjoy powerful family drama stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more.